Welcome. Artemisia and Hildegard, an Exorcism in One Act by Carolyn Gage. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll be waiting just a few moments while everyone joins us, and then Carolyn will come on and start the show. Thank you very much. Welcome everyone who's joining us now. This is Artemisia and Hildegard, an Exorcism in One Act by Carolyn Gage. We're just waiting a few moments before we start as more folks join us. We'll be just on in a moment. Thank you. What? Shoot.
It's okay.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see how many people are here tonight. Welcome to the reading of Artemisia and Hildegard, an Exorcism in One Act. I'm Carolyn Gage. I wrote the play, and I will be reading the role of Artemisia Gentileschi. I'm going to ask you to please refrain from typing on the chat. I know just the panelists can see it, but it's distracting, so please refrain from that until we get to the Q&A at the end. Thank you. My friend Akia Woods is going to be reading the role of Hildegard von Bingen. The play reading will be about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and it's going to be followed by a talkback moderated by Dr. Stripe Gandara. After the reading, you will have an opportunity to type in your questions for the talkback and also type in the howdy and all the greetings that I see and you're so enthusiastic about. This reading is free and we're delighted to accept donations also, which will pay for the webinar platform and then be shared by the actors, moderator, and technical support. You can donate through PayPal or Venmo. The PayPal account is my email address, carolyn@carolyngage.com. The Venmo is at Akia-Woods-1, and those addresses and that information will be in the Q&A part after the show. So don't worry about that now. I am a playwright, performer, and director. I live on a Maine island, and I'm semi-retired now. I have 87 plays and 9 collections of plays. These are all online at my website. You can just Google my name. All of them are for sale as paperbacks and ebooks. All of my work is also on Kindle. Akia Woods is a veteran of my first lesbian theater company in Ashland, Oregon from 1989 to 1991. She is a lesbian jazz singer, actor, and ballroom dancer living on the Oregon coast with her dog and two cats. She's currently president of the board for the Oregon Coast Council for the Arts. Stripe Gandara, our moderator, is the Director of Academic Support and Disability Services at Erickson Institute in Chicago. She holds a doctorate in English Literature and Women's and Gender Studies from the University of Nebraska. Kate Pickup McMullen, our Tech Director and Slide Wrangler and Reader of Stage Directions, strives for a growth mindset, but at times her curiosity does get her into unexpected situations. When her personal soundtrack is not playing Shakira, the Lumineers, and Mumford & Sons, she's listening to an audiobook and reading a physical book ranging from sci-fi to a Bernd Heinrich to the newest young adult fantasy. Also, the National Museum in London is hosting a major exhibit of Artemisia Gentileschi's work right now, and you can actually take an online tour with a curator through the museum. The website is amazing with lots of art and information. And also, the auction house Christie's is hosting a website about Artemisia's work right now, and it has a great title, Theater of Revenge. All right, folks, that's it. So let's get started. Artemisia and Hildegard.
Artemisia and Hildegard, An Exorcism in One Act by Carolyn Gage. This is a panel for International Conference on the subject of women in the arts. The name of this panel is Women Artists Strategies for Survival. The stage has a podium, 2 chairs, and a small table with 1 pitcher of water and 2 glasses. Artemisia Gentileschi enters and seats herself in the chair to the left of the podium. She rises to pour herself a glass of water, sits down again, and begins to look over her notes. Hildegard von Bingen enters. She's carrying a bouquet of flowers along with her notes. Hildegard sweeps to the podium and bangs her folder down on it. Artemisia turns to look at her, but Hildegard pretends not to notice.
Knew there wouldn't be any flowers. Why is it whenever they have a panel on art, there's never the slightest attempt to be decorative? I've gotten so used to it, I just bring my own anymore. Now, do you see anything I can put these in?
Hildegard von Bingen?
Oh, yes, that's me.
I'm Artemisia Gentileschi, and I met you last year at the conference for the National Museum of Women in the Arts. We were on the panel about images of empowerment.
Oh, here. You don't mind, do you?
Artemisia withdraws her hand. Hildegard places the flowers in the water pitcher and proceeds to arrange them.
There. They really should have given each of us a pitcher. What did they think we'd be passing the water back and forth? There. That looks a little more artistic, don't you think? Well, yes, last year in Washington. Yes, images of empowerment. That was certainly a free-for-all, wasn't it? Not very empowering, if you ask me. A group of women shouting at each other. I wonder where the other artists are.
Well, there aren't any others.
Oh, really? You can hardly call 2 speakers a panel, can you? It's more like a debate, wouldn't you say? And I'm not sure at all I came here to debate.
Well, I'm just going to show my work and then answer questions.
Yes, well, I just wish they'd told me ahead of time. Somebody apparently saw to it that you had the information.
Well, I asked.
I wonder where the moderator is.
Well, there isn't going to be a moderator.
What? I really don't like having to introduce myself.
Well, do you want me to do it?
No. Well, I am.
Is there anything in particular that you want me to say?
No, just tell them who I am. You could leave out the part about my sainthood. It tends to put audiences off.
Oh my God. Welcome.
I, no, I tell you what, why don't I introduce you first and then you can introduce me.
I don't care.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hildegard von Bingham, and on behalf of the International Conference for Women in the Arts, I would like to welcome you to our panel tonight. Women Artists, Strategies for Survival. It is my privilege to introduce the other speaker tonight, my distinguished colleague, Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia is a painter from the 17th century Italy, isn't that right?
Mm.
At a time when few women were allowed a career in the arts, she was fortunate enough to have been born the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi, one of the most successful painters in Rome. It was through his interest and support that she gained the patronage of some of the most influential men in Italy. One of her paintings gained the success by being mistakenly attributed to male painters of her day. And well, it's only just now that historians and art critics are beginning to recognize these paintings as the work of a female artist, a task which has been difficult because her work so closely imitates the styles and themes of the men with whom she competed.
Thank you.
Oh, but
Thank you, Hildegard.
I wasn't through.
Yeah, that's all right. I really just like to let the art speak for itself.
Well, but you can't separate the artist's experience in life from her art.
Oh, I can.
But I'm sure you'll agree that one of the ways in which the work of women artists differs from the work of men
No,
is that
I don't identify myself as a woman artist. I'm a painter who just happens to be a woman.
well, well, I don't know what to say. I guess I just expected that for a panel titled "Women Artists,"
Do you want me to introduce you?
oh, if you like.
It's my pleasure to introduce the other member of the panel tonight, my distinguished colleague, Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard von Bingen is a nun,
Abbess.
abbess from the 12th century Germany. Hildegard is a woman of many accomplishments. She writes religious skits for the nuns to perform for each other, and she's written some religious songs.
I prefer to use the word spiritual, and they're polyphonic choral works.
Ah, and she has also written a spiritual book.
Three.
Three books which describe in detail her spiritual visions.
Mystical.
Would you like to take over?
Oh, no, you're doing fine.
She's also written several self-help books on herbs and nutrition, and between writing all these books, she has somehow found time to design the illustrations for them, although the actual painting of them is done by the nuns, who share her commitment to collective art and anonymity.
That's not entirely accurate.
Oh, did I leave something out?
No, dear, what you said was fine. Thank you. I appreciate Ms. Gentileschi's introduction, but I'm afraid it might have created an unfortunate impression. Secular artists have difficulty grasping the experience of the spiritually minded artist. Now, I'm going to take you to a little mental excursion with me for a moment. We are going to travel to a little village in Germany together, and we're going to visit a child who lives there, a very special child. She lies very still on her bed, as quiet as a mouse and not moving at all, but she's not asleep. Far from it, her tiny eyes are wide open as she watches a bright ring of light like a halo fill her room. And she's listening to voices that no one else can hear. Her little brain is seared with constant pain. This is a very different child, not at all like her 9 brothers and sisters. And her parents ask God constantly, what is his will for this little one? And the answer they receive breaks their heart. Give her back to God. And they were willing to put obedience to God above their own selfish pleasure. And so, when their daughter was only 8 years old, they took her to a Benedictine monastery. How many of you know what an anchoress is? Oh, an anchoress is a woman who has chosen to give herself to God, much like a nun, except that the anchoress chooses to spend her entire life inside her cell, dedicating herself to the life of the spirit.
Oh my God.
Her initiation rite is a funeral service, symbolizing the fact that from this time on, she is dead to the world. After the ceremony, she enters her cell and the entrance is walled up. Well, except for a slot, food, and so on. Obviously, becoming an anchoress is a radical step for a woman to take. When I was 8 years old, my parents, in the supreme sacrifice of their lives, took that step for me. I was sealed up inside a cell with another anchoress, a woman named Huda, who had been a friend of our family. I did not set foot outside that cell for 10 years.
What?
My art is a revelation of the spirit, which I cultivated for all those years in the confines of that cell. It is impossible for you to understand my art without understanding my life. This panel is titled Women Artists, Strategies for Survival. This is the strategy I have come to share with you. My art has been preserved for 9 centuries, not just 4.
Oh.
And that is because it's part of the life of an entire community of women. We share in the creation of each other's art because it becomes a vital part of our history and our tradition. And that is why my songs and my books and my paintings have been cherished and preserved for 900 years. Perhaps this would be a good time to show the first slide. The first slide, please. This is an illumination from my first visionary work, Scivias.
And is this a self-portrait?
Let's just say it's a portrait of a nun who is receiving inspiration to write directly from God. You see, nuns were not allowed to learn reading or writing.
But you did.
No, at the age of 42, I received this vision of blinding light, which felt like it was permeating every cell of my brain. And after this vision, I found that I not only knew how to read and write in Latin, but that I intuitively understood the meaning of all the chapters in both the Old and New Testament.
Without reading them.
How could I? It was forbidden. And this vision was accompanied by a voice that said, say and write what you see and hear. Well, naturally, I tried to ignore the voice, feeling that it couldn't really apply to me. And of course, I was punished for this, as we always are for ignoring the will of God. I became deathly ill. I lay in my bed completely unable to move. The abbot of Cuno came to see me in this condition, and I couldn't even turn my head to look at him, not even when he ordered me to. And this act of insubordination from a woman filled him with holy terror. Needless to say, the Pope responded immediately with permission for me to write whenever I felt called to do so. And that is what this illustration symbolizes.
Yeah, so we see.
The point I am making is that women do not have to be dependent on men. Do you know, I invented my own language. I designed an alternative alphabet. I didn't even use the same letters as the men, and I only taught it to women. Of course, this is incomprehensible to women who think like men, women who produce their work for purely commercial purposes.
That's
But I was talking about the special language of women. Could we see the next slide, please? Here is another illumination from the Scivias.
oh, what is it?
It is a painting in the secret language of women. Oh, tender flower of the meadow. Oh, sweet sap of the apple. And oh, harvest without pith, which does not divert hearts to sin. Oh, noble vessel, which is not defiled or consumed in the dance of the ancient cave, and which is not oozing with the wounds of the ancient destroyer. I wrote that poem for Rupertsburg. Rupertsburg was my greatest trial and my greatest achievement. Every woman needs a Rupertsburg, and every woman could have a Rupertsburg if she would only learn to fight for it as I did. You remember that my spiritual life began as an anchoress at a monastery where I shared a cell with another woman named Huda. Over the years, Huda and I began to acquire a reputation for our spirituality, and a number of women were attracted to our lifestyle as anchoresses. The monks had to expand our little cell over and over again to accommodate the new arrivals. We found after a decade, we'd become a convent. I was elected the prioress at age 38. Shortly after that, I received the greatest vision of my entire life. I had a vision to take the women away from the men. Well, the monks were in a complete uproar. I was by now the chief spiritual and material asset of the monastery, the goose that laid the golden egg, so to speak. No, they did not want to see me leave and take the nuns with me. And of course, the parents of some of our girls were in a tizzy. You see, the monastery had all the comforts of home, great stone buildings, acres and acres of cultivated fields, and a very celebrated vineyard. Rupertsburg, 15 miles down the river, had nothing but a few temporary buildings. It was, well, a desert by comparison. Everyone asked me, what's the point of moving the sisters from a place where they're perfectly comfortable to such great poverty? The point? We would be away from the men.
Oh, but you still needed the men's permission to move.
Yeah, of course, but the point is, oh, we got it.
Oh, yes, like asking your husband for a night out with the girls.
We were not wives.
Well, what is the difference? You couldn't own anything, you couldn't read or write, you couldn't go
The
anywhere.
difference is we didn't have to sleep with them. Yes, we had to work around the men. Every woman has to do that. But the question is, does she work around them for her own gain at the expense of other women? Or does she work around them to help liberate her sisters? Let me tell you a story, a story of a nun. Her name was Ricardus, and she was my joy in living. She was my right hand. I would have walked through fire for Ricardus, and I believed she would have done the same for me, but I was wrong. After we moved to Rupertsburg, she became cold and unfriendly. Ricardus simply could not see the world except through the lens of male approval.
What happened to her?
Oh, she began to use her family connections to get herself appointed abbess at another convent, one that was connected with a monastery.
Well, did she get the appointment?
I did everything I could to block it. I even went so far as to ask the Pope to intervene.
You were jealous of her.
Me? No, Ricardus was the jealous one. She just couldn't wait to prove her teacher wrong. I could see her whole plan. She was setting herself up to become a rival abbess. She was going to take my best nuns with her. Her convent would have all the material comforts we left behind. Oh, she was going to show me. And the saddest part was she really believed the men were on her side. They were just using her as a pawn to get to me. Do you know what they did the day she left Rupertsburg? They sent an emissary in case I tried to use physical force to restrain her. Can you imagine the humiliation? Rescuing the girl from my evil clutches. It was quite a show, let me tell you.
So she did get the appointment after all.
Well, she was only able to keep it for a few months.
Oh, you had her transferred.
No. No, Ricardus died.
Well, you don't sound very sorry.
I was sorry when her soul died, but the death of her body did not interest me.
Oh my God. Do you have some more slides?
What? Uh, no, I've taken enough time. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience of women.
Well, Hildegard is a tough act to follow. I'm just going to show some paintings and tell you a little bit about them. I don't really have a fancy philosophy. My formula for survival is pretty simple. Make it great. And I know Hildegard and her nuns find poverty uplifting for the soul, and maybe it's because I'm not religious or spiritual, but poverty has not been good for my soul or any other part of my anatomy. Poverty makes me hungry and nervous, and I don't paint well when I'm hungry and nervous. Poverty makes me buy cheap materials, and I don't like to work with cheap pigment. And poverty makes a girl get married when she doesn't want to, and my daughter is never going to have to do that because she is never going to be poor. May we see the first slide, please? This is the first painting I did after I left home. It's called Judith Slaying a Holofernes. I was 19. Hildegard should recognize the subject.
Oh, yes.
Judith was an Israelite. She was a widow. Now that's her in the blue dress, and she had a companion named Abra, and that's Abra in the red. Anyway, Judith and Abra's village was being attacked, so Judith and Abra went to pay a visit to the enemy general. Judith pretended to like him, and then she and Abra got him falling down drunk, and then they cut off his head, which, even if a man is passed out, is pretty hard to do. I mean, he's going to have a certain number of reflexes, and then, of course, there's a technical problem of the cervical vertebra, which actually overlap each other. You're going to have to cut through the bone. Now, most of the painters who did Judith showed her standing at arm's length, holding out the sword like this, looking squeamish. Well, you can't even slice a ham from that position, much less the neck of a 250-pound man. And I wanted to get across the idea that Judith was an ordinary woman, and she would encounter the same problems that any one of us would if we were to cut off a man's head.
Did you bring some other slides?
We'll come back to this later. Next slide, please. This is Susanna
Ah,
and the elders.
you painted that during your trial, didn't you?
I painted it when I was 16.
But wasn't it related to your courtroom experience?
My art is not related to my experience. Didn't I say that? Now, the story of Susanna, like the story of Judith, is from the Bible. Well, it's not actually from the Bible, but from the Apocrypha. As our resident abbess, would you like to tell us about the Apocrypha?
No, go ahead. It's your painting.
Well, the Apocrypha is the part of the Bible where they moved all the deviant women. It's not considered to be the Word of God like the rest of the Bible, which is why the women like Susanna and Judith were moved there, away from the important males. Kind of like Rupertsburg.
Uh, we moved ourselves to Rupertsburg.
Yes, of course. But the point is, many people will never know the stories of Judith and Susanna because they have been separated from the mainstream Bible stories. Are you familiar with Esther's remark in the Apocrypha?
Which one?
The one where she says she doesn't want to marry the king and she says she'd rather wear a menstrual rag on her head than a crown.
You have a painting of that?
Oh, would you like to commission one? I was talking about Susanna. Now she's taking a bath, and these men are spying on her. They're elders of the church, and they've just thought of this plan where they're going to tell Susanna she has to let them rape her, or else they're going to make up a story they caught her having sex with someone other than her husband, which, since women weren't allowed to testify, would mean an automatic death penalty. Now, Susanna is a popular subject for painters, voyeurs, and rapists. Rembrandt, Tintoretto, Rubens, they've all tried to do her. They usually show her trying to protect her body. And since the men are asking her permission to rape her, I don't think that's very realistic. Susanna can refuse. In fact, she does. When the woman is covering herself like this or like this, she's relating to her body the same way the men are. And Susanna doesn't do that. If she saw her body as an object to protect, she would probably have said yes, because letting them rape her was supposedly going to save her life. But she said no, which means she did not see the body as something apart from herself.
Excuse me, Artemisia.
Yes?
Don't you think that her refusal might have had something to do with her principles?
No, I don't. The men are disgusting. She relates to them as if they're a pair of mayflies buzzing around her head.
Susanna went to court, didn't she?
It wasn't her idea.
But they did find her innocent.
She should never have been accused. Next slide. Oh, this is Lucretia, and it's hard to see the detail on the slide, but she has a knife in her left hand, and she's holding her breast with her right. And she's holding her breast like this, pushing it up and then squeezing the nipple out between the second and third fingers, like she's getting ready to nurse. Now, Lucretia was a Roman woman. She was raped by her brother-in-law, and she killed herself so that no one could accuse her of having cheated on her husband.
Why is she holding her breast like a nursing mother if she's going to stab herself?
Well, why do you think?
I don't know. That's why I asked.
I wanted to illustrate that she is torn between the demands of her motherhood to stay alive for the sake of her children and the demands of her husband to kill herself in order to save his honor. And this is the whole problem with Lucretia. Her body belongs to her husband and her children. It's not even hers. That's why she kills herself. She identifies herself as a woman.
She needs a spiritual sense of herself.
She needs a career.
Then she just belonged to the career instead of a man.
It's her spiritual sense that's telling her to kill herself.
No, it isn't. Her spiritual sense would tell her that she was untouched by physical violence.
Untouched by rape?
She does not have to identify with her body's experience.
What are you talking about? That is exactly why she was able to murder herself.
She took her physical life because she was not in touch with her spiritual one.
She killed herself because she wasn't allowed to kill the rapist.
Well, you certainly do have an affinity for violent themes.
Well, I knew it. Is this the lecture where you tell me how unladylike my subjects are, how a woman artist shouldn't paint naked women or acts of violence?
It's no concern of mine what you do or don't paint.
Oh, really? What isn't that what makes women artists so special?
Women artists do have a different aesthetic.
And that aesthetic includes fruit bowls and landscapes, doesn't it? With the occasional Madonna and child. But it doesn't include dead men, does it? Or women with sharp objects.
I think you're putting words in my mouth. I don't see where I've criticized any of your paintings here today.
Oh, no, you've just ignored them. That's what women always do, unless, of course, they think I'm a man, and then I get judged by an entirely different standard.
It sounds like you've had some very unfortunate experiences with women.
Very.
That's really too bad because women can be tremendously supportive and nurturing.
Well, I've never seen it.
Maybe you should come to Rupertsburg.
Oh my God, that is the last place I should go.
What makes you say that?
Because in Rupertsburg, you haven't got any critical standards. How can you when every woman is apparently inspired by God? I can just see it. First, I'd be told how limited representational art is, how left brain. And I'd have to hear this from women whose draftsmanship is so rotten they have to make a virtue out of inaccuracy. And then I would have to hear how technique is just a male substitute for inspiration. And what I really need to focus on is my emotional blocks. Then I would get the lecture on the morally corrosive effects of depicting sex and violence. This from women whose art is insipid and totally unoriginal, but towing the party line. And then I would hear how compulsive I am about my work from women who don't have the discipline to take themselves seriously. And finally, and here we're getting to the heart of the matter, I would be patronized by a pack of sanctimonious losers for the crash commercialism of actually trying to make a living off my art when they'd be lucky if they could give their work away.
You know, I didn't think it would be a good idea to have a panel without a moderator. And I think it's especially awkward when one of the artists on the panel openly hates women and personally attacks the other speaker.
What are you talking about? You have been attacking me from the minute you set foot on this stage, you and your shit about women artists. What a hypocrite. Oh, you want to talk about survival strategies? How about watch out for other women?
Well, I don't need to.
Oh, yes, you do.
Since you don't seem to believe me, I suggest you come to Rupertsburg and see for yourself.
Okay, on one condition.
What's that?
You have to tell the truth.
What do you mean?
Oh, I mean, tell them you taught yourself how to read and write, that it was candles after curfew and not some bolt of lightning that lit up your consciousness. Tell them it was you, not the Holy Spirit, who dictated your manuscripts. Tell them that the visions you have are a product of your own imagination and not transmissions from the spirit world, and that your mystical comas are nothing but sit-down strikes. Tell them that you make your art to please yourself, not God, and that you are an abbess with an international reputation, not through divine grace, but because you happen to be one hell of a diplomat, a very clever politician, a woman of enormous ambition who enjoys being on top and who will do anything to stay there. You tell your little sisters of charity that you earned your power over them and that the way you earned it was by being better than all of them. Tell them that, and let's just see how supportive your community is.
Well, Artemisia, I think we're back where we started from, aren't we? I'm afraid your attack on me is really only an indictment of yourself.
Why don't you tell the truth?
You know, Artemisia, you're right. I'm not being honest. It's not honest of me to sit here and put up with your abuse. I am going to ask the audience to pass a resolution tonight protesting your inclusion on this panel. Furthermore, I am going to ask this audience to ban any woman who represents the male art establishment from participation in women's art events, whether they're gallery shows, panels, or conferences. Women like you, Artemisia, belong with the male institutions which have fostered you. You'd be happier there, and we would certainly be happier too. You are just the kind of woman-hating woman they're always looking to hire for their token positions.
Never mind. You don't have to take a vote. I'm leaving. Shit. You notice none of it's been about the art, but then that's just like a man, isn't it? To want to focus on the actual work.
We are talking about the art. Most of us don't have the privilege of walking out on each other. We have nowhere else to go. Even when it gets too painful, we still have to stay and listen to each other. We have to work through our fears and our jealousies and our betrayals. We can't go running back to the men because for most of us, men are the enemy.
And you think they aren't mine? You think I don't know what men are about? Look at my paintings. Bring up my last slide.
I believe we've already seen this one.
No, you haven't. This is my second version. I painted it 10 years after I did the first one. Look at it. Look at it. It's two women cutting off the head of a man. Now, why do you think I painted the same picture twice? Because I like men? Because they've been so good to me?
Because it sells.
Because when I was 16, my art teacher, my precious male art teacher, came into my bedroom and he raped me. And then my father, the famous painter Orazio Gentileschi, the one you think was such a great mentor to me, my own father made me go to court and testify about the rape. And the judge had me tortured to see if I was telling the truth. He didn't torture the rapist who lied through his teeth, telling everybody what a whore I was. And they had two midwives, two women, put their hands in my vagina to inspect me, right there in front of the clerk. Do you think my father cared about me at all when he let them do that? And where were the women? Well, my mother died when I was 12, and then there's my best friend Tuzia, who lived upstairs from me. And do you know who it was who arranged to let the rapist into the house when my father wasn't home? Tuzia. She was in on it with him. And why? Because I can paint. Because I wasn't going to have to fuck for a living, legally or not, and she could not stand the idea, and neither can you.
Well,
but I did not kill myself like Lucretia because I was that good. But don't think that just because I get professional commissions that they're ever as high as male painters get, or on time, or paid in full. It doesn't matter how long I've been painting or how good I am, because I'm always a woman, and that means I'm always an amateur. And you want to give me shit because I don't walk around advertising the fact, oh, I'm a woman artist.
You should have told us about the rape earlier.
Why? So you could patronize me like you're doing now? Just because you think sadism was good for your soul doesn't mean you get to inflict your pain on me.
What do you mean, sadism?
What your family did to you.
My family?
Your family, for Christ's sake. They locked you up in a cell for 10 years because they wanted to get rid of you.
What? No, it was the will of God.
Oh, 10 children and the youngest one sick all the time. Pretty convenient, this will of God.
That is not true. No, I was more loved than any of my brothers and sisters.
Oh, give me a break. Parents who love their children don't send them to prison.
It was a monastery, not a prison.
Well, what the hell difference to an 8-year-old? You never saw the sun. You never felt the rain. You never rolled on the grass. You never had any playmates.
I have been amply compensated by the gifts of the spirit.
Oh my God. You are one hell of a survivor. Yeah, I got to hand it to you, Hildegard. I don't know how anyone could turn 10 years of torture into some kind of privilege, but somehow your little 8-year-old brain flipped the whole thing around so that not only weren't you abandoned by your parents, but you were somehow more loved than the rest of the family. More loved, in fact, than any child in the history of the world. And I have no doubt that this fiction kept you alive all those years, but somebody inside there knows the real truth. And that somebody must be pissed as hell. No wonder you have headaches all the time.
You don't understand God's love.
That may be true, but I'll tell you this. If anybody ever tried to take my daughter away, I'd kill him with my bare hands.
The male identified woman can only meet violence with violence.
The male identified woman is you, Hildegard. The male identified woman meets violence with denial.
Instead of using your rape as an opportunity for spiritual growth, you've let your hatred and anger turn inward and fester, allowing it to corrupt your art. And
you are so full of shit.
I'm not your enemy, Artemisia. I'm trying to be supportive.
The hell you are. You're trying to convert me. You are trying to convert all of us. You want to ask these women to get rid of me? All right, fine. But first, let's ask them what they think about you. All right. All right. How many of you think Hildegard von Bingen was abused as a child? Come on, raise your hands. How many of you think locking an 8-year-old in a cell was an atrocity?
Well, congratulations, Artemisia. It appears you've won the debate.
I wasn't competing.
Oh, even better. To win when it looks like you weren't even trying. Aren't you going to stay and savor your victory?
What is the point?
The point is, you get to stay and tell us more about the secret art of killing men.
There is no secret, Hildegard. It takes 2 women to do it.
It can't. Oh.
What a powerful performance by Carolyn Gage and Akia Woods. Such an important and complicated play. Let's just take a moment to come back to our bodies and sit with the complexities that just unfolded between Artemisia and Hildegard. I'm Stripe Gandera, and I will be moderating tonight's talkback. In a minute, I will invite the actors to join us for a conversation. First, I'll do a little housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A icon. Please type your questions there by clicking on that icon. Is there something you'd like to ask the artists about the play or about their perspectives on some of the issues the play raises in contemporary society? Questions about being a female artist or simply just about being female in patriarchy? Also, please know that the other participants or viewers will not be able to see the question you ask. Only the 4 of us will be able to see that question. As I moderate the conversation with our actors, Kate, our tech guru, will sort through the Q&A and look for opportunities to read some of the questions from you. Also, as a reminder, if you'd like to donate to the production this evening, please do so at Carolyn's PayPal, carolyn@carolyngage.com, or Akia Woods' Venmo account, which is at Akia-Woods-1. I'd like to ask Carolyn, Akia, and Kate to join me now. Let's begin the conversation. So let me start by saying what a compelling job you both did. Bravo. Each of you captured your character's perspective with such sincerity and passion. And at the end of the play, I felt that I understood both women's experiences and the choices each woman made or had to make given her situation. I'd like to share my opening thoughts and then move into the questions. But let me say, for me, the play made clear how difficult the choices are for women living in patriarchy. and even for those who temporarily leave patriarchy to join a community of women. In patriarchy, as we all know, the socioeconomic and political conditions are not healthy for women. And so we choose a path of resistance or survival that makes the most sense to us given our circumstances. In this process, we often end up defending our story, our choices, and become so set in our beliefs because we believe that our survival depends on it. We often end up battling each other and judging other women for the choices they make because they are not the ones that we made, rather than joining forces and becoming stronger together. Clearly, this disidentification with each other is a byproduct of patriarchy. I have this image in my head of men sitting around smoking cigars with their feet kicked up on their desk, laughing with each other, while women are out undermining our collective well-being, serving his interest by fighting with each other. After reading your play, Carolyn, I thought about so many of the activist groups that I've been a part of and about the female friendships that I've lost because our stories and our choices look so different and inappropriate for each other, to each other. Our relationships with each other broke down, and so the movement stalled because we didn't make the effort to understand each other. It was easier to just walk away than it was to get into a discussion like the one Artemisia and Hildegard just had. And even here, after both women explained to each other why they chose the path they did, vulnerabilities are exposed and Artemisia ends up walking away, even though she knows that two women are stronger together and that their solidarity is the only way to kill patriarchy. So Carolyn, let me ask my first question to you for some context for the origination of this play. What was going on in your life and in your career when you wrote this play? And what brought you to understand the content so well?
I wrote this play, I think, around 1992 or 91. And it was after I closed my first lesbian theater company, which was in Ashland, Oregon. I opened it in 1989, and I produced 16 plays in 2.5 years, most of which I wrote myself. I directed myself. Often I performed in them. I produced and publicized and published myself. And I'd been 5 years working in mainstream, and I left everything to do the kind of theater that I needed to write. And so, everything. I had burned all my bridges, all my eggs were in one basket. And I loved this theater company as I have never loved a person, place, or thing in my life. And it just really blew up in my face for so many reasons. And it was so upsetting to me and traumatic that I wrote 3 plays at the end of that period. The Anastasia trials, where the audience actually has to vote on what happened because I couldn't figure it out. And then this play, and then a musical that still has no music called Women on the Land. But those were all efforts to come to terms with what on earth happened with that theater company in Ashland. And obviously, one of the major tensions in my life personally was separatism versus, actually making a living and being in the game, and Artemisia clearly was a major painter. She was in court circles getting fabulous commissions, still not as high as the men's, but, and I was ambitious, but I had moved down to Southern Oregon to be in the bosom of the women's land communities. And those were lesbian land collectives that had been started in 1975, I think. I got there around 87. So they've been going for about 11 years, maybe 15. And this was one of the greatest social experiments, not just in America, but anywhere in the world. These were communities of women who did everything without men, lived without men, worked without men. If you couldn't fix it with a crew of women, it didn't get fixed. It was for me, because I'd gone through graduate school and everything. I think my whole career in theater academically, I had never read but one female playwright, probably Lillian Hellman. It was all men all the time. And suddenly I'm in a community where people don't even play music with even one male musician in the band. You know, it was all women all the time. It was this huge, invigorating crash course in decolonizing. And it changed me forever. It changed what I thought my life work was forever. And I really can't put into words what that was like. Also, my theater company and the heartbreaking way that it ended was, so many good intentions, so much emotional violence. Like, how could this be? So that's where the play came from.
Thank you.
Does that answer it?
Yeah. And so you mentioned this, where you and Akia met in Southern Oregon while living in a community of women. So let's talk a little bit about what it was like to live in women's community. Akia, let's start with you, and then if Carolyn, you'll also add your perspective.
I guess before I can really even talk about living in women's community, I need to give a big shout out to the Girl Scouts. um, the Girl Scouts, I know, didn't work for everybody. It's a volunteer driven organization, and sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. But when and where I lived, scouting was all girls and women. There were no male leaders, no male camp counselors. My family was not particularly well off when I was a kid, but somehow I have to give my mom credit for understanding how important it was for me to go to camp, and she made it happen. And camp was my introduction to living in women's community, somewhere between learning all about the plants and the trees and the birds and chopping wood and making fires and lashing benches and whatever all else we did. I began to understand what it was really like to be together, just us. And I totally craved it. I went back every year. And then as an adult, when I finally found the Southern Oregon land women, and yes, I still spell that with a Y, it was amazing. Like being at camp again, only like for real this time. It took me a while to actually move to land, but our whole women's community was centered around all of the various lands, and it was difficult beyond imagination, and also, well, rewarding beyond imagination. It was difficult. It was difficult because we really did need to work out all the emotional stuff and all the power struggles and all the breakup dramas and all the money struggles and all the whatever else there was. They're like Hildegard said, there really wasn't any way to escape them. But it was rewarding in so many ways. For instance, we really didn't, like Carolyn said, we didn't ever hire men to do anything. Back then, female carpenters and plumbers and electricians, they weren't something you found in rural Southern Oregon. And so, well, we couldn't have afforded to hire anybody anyway. So we learned to do for ourselves. Did we do everything perfectly? Of course not. But we learned to do things well enough, and we always learned from what we did. But all the power struggles and all the emotional stuff we lived through, I can honestly say that we all expected that there was nothing that other women couldn't do. If there was a limit to what you might learn or do, it was self-imposed through your old tapes, not something coming from community. Unless you somehow triggered somebody else's old tapes or fears or whatever, like some of what happened with the theater. I also learned that if women pitch in to help, there's nothing too heavy to do. I once had to move a piano from Ashland out into the woods. And my cabin, the road didn't come anywhere near it. And it was way uphill from the road. And we got the truck there with the piano in it and discussed, driving over this beautiful meadow. But in the end, we just decided to pick the darn thing up and carry it up the big hill into the little cabin. It wasn't something that 2 or 3 women could have done or even should have tried to do, but with enough of us under that huge old upright piano, it went right up the hill and into the cabin, and the meadow was left completely unharmed. So many things I learned like that. We cut all our wood. I brought gravity feed water down to the cabin from a spring. Women helped me cut holes in the cabin and put in used windows to brighten up the space. And later, one woman who actually had landed a plumbing apprenticeship helped me put in a little tiny propane water heater, which was just so wonderful. When I
Yes. So
finally
you,
made my way to Mishfest, it didn't feel as magical to me as it did to the city women, because it just felt like normal life, like women doing for ourselves and each other. But over the years, with repeated visits, I came to realize just how magical that space was, and incorporating so many different women from so many different backgrounds, and making our way through together.
Thanks, Akia.
Carolyn, did you have insight on your experience that you're willing to share with us?
Well, I just want to say that one of the reasons that my experience is so emotionally violent is we all. I think I speak for more than myself, but if I don't, forgive me. But there was a general sense of how wonderful it would be as soon as we got away from the men. And so the expectations we had for each other were extremely high, maybe not even human. We were all going to be sisters, like race, class, ability, ableism, all that, age, none of that would matter because the sisterhood is, and I think that made it all the more bitter when all those issues, and in 87, alcohol and drug recovery was just starting to come through the community, but incest and child sexual abuse recovery, and I was at that time an unrecovered incest survivor, had not really gotten there yet. And so, there was all kinds of acting out behaviors when people are not in recovery. And so coupled with, it was like, why this is the only reason this isn't utopian sisterhood I expected and needed it to be, because I've made huge financial sacrifices for this, is you're not acting right. That was the depth of the analysis we could bring, because of course we're still protecting our addictions or protecting ourselves from the horror of our childhood or whatever. There's a lot of reasons that it was that way, and I think that when oppressed people, it's biblical. When they got out of Egypt, they didn't go right into the promised land. They behaved so badly because they still had a master slave paradigm. So they just recreated that among themselves, and God came down and said, you must wander in the wilderness 40 years before, and have that generation that was so oppressed die off before you can get into the promised land. And I thought of that Bible story a lot because I felt like, where's the promised land? And it's like, this is really terrible. We're doing to each other what men did to us on some level, and we have access in a way that men didn't, because we were trusting each other and we were vulnerable. And I just was like, oh my God, this is way hard. This is almost harder than patriarchy. Yeah, all right, I'm going to shut up. So, but yeah.
Yeah, so my experience in separate female-only space was life-changing, similar in different ways to what you said. That makes sense. But I first attended the Michigan Women's Music Festival when I was 23 years old. So it was back in 1998. I attended 11 festivals. And it was at Fest that I first saw other butches, and not just saw them, but actually took them in. It was the first time for me seeing butch women revered and centered. Butch women were integral to the creation of the space. never seen that before. I saw butch elders who had been walking the path, unconventional path for decades. I saw contemporaries who looked just like me, and I was so enamored by their fashion and their swagger and their competence, right? Akia, you're talking about, that you learned this self-sufficiency and that you were competent as capable as women. And these were very, very cool women. And I walked the path with them, ate lunch with them, washed dishes with them, danced with them. And seeing them, I learned to re-see myself as a powerful, beautiful, capable, female-bodied butch woman.
Mm.
It was and is the only space I'd ever been in that celebrated, loved, and centered butch women. So I hold separate space as a space that gave me the tools to survive in a hostile, butch-hating, woman-hating society. Are there lessons you learned from your experience living with women, or you've spoken to this, I think, in some ways, but any lessons, surprises, challenges, or gifts? And I think, Carolyn, what you said is perhaps right, that we hold this space to be everything, right? That you experienced or you hoped to meet sisterhood, and then upon arrival, it looked different than your dreams and your longings, or the ease of it was thwarted with reality, right? That there were a lot of damaged women with painful stories and traumas that they were reenacting, or haven't dealt with. We saw the gamut, right? The wide array of all women in a shared space. But are there any lessons?
Well, I think the lessons were, for me, it was so awful. It was, and I had a complete breakdown. I wouldn't leave my house for a while. I never again had a lesbian theater company like that. I did productions. I had production companies, but never a theater company. I really needed to understand what happened, and I wrote those three plays trying to sort through it. Then I wrote a manual on how to direct and produce lesbian theater, where I really triaged every mistake I ever made. I took it very seriously, and I got into recovery as in Al-Anon, 28 years and counting. And I also did a lot of recovery around the incest. I got, it was a bottom for me. It was like, all right, this is never going to happen again. Now, what needs to happen to make sure that that's the case? Um, so it was enormous for me. It was a tremendous experience, life changing. Um, yeah, and you would ask something else. Well, this play, Artemisia and Hildegard, you could see I was just struggling with like, how on earth can we reconcile this? Because, the patriot, if you need to pay the mortgage, if you're raising a daughter, you got to make better bank than the women who are living up on the cabins with hauling the piano up there. And those women are always we're gonna be pitted against each other. So how are we gonna do this? And reading this now, 30 years later, it's so clear to me both these women are survivors of massive trauma, and they have dug into their survival strategies. This is the way, as survivors do, black and white thinking. They must, as Akia's character says, not have the luxury to walk out on each other. We have to make ourselves stay in the room, and we have to learn to listen to each other. That's, for me, very clearly the answer to the question I was desperately asking in 86. And I was not ready to listen. I didn't have any recovery skills. And that's where I learned to kind of have hard conversations and to be kind of brutally honest with myself, kind of as still working on that. But, uh, yeah.
So in the play, we do see two very different survival strategies unfold, and both women's choices, I think, to most of us, appear to make sense given their circumstances. While Artemisia and Hildegard have two seemingly conflicting philosophies, and each woman is trying to explain or defend her choices, is there a right philosophy? Or is there a right philosophy for you? Do you side with Hildegard, who comes out of a separatist space and insists that commercial success is an act of patriarchal assimilation? Do you side with Artemisia, who denounces women's communities and identification with her female sex and competes in the male world to be seen as a talent so that she can sell her work and take care of her and her daughter?
I have to say, the older I get, the more everything, including my hair, is gray, not black and white. And I think my experience is honestly, I negotiate that division every single day. Like this week, I am going to submit a lot of workplaces where I know the chances are very slim they'll get produced, but I do it to keep myself going. So there's a little bit of separatism in my mindset, but I make myself do it because there's a little bit of Artemisia. Like we got to just keep trying, you know. Oh, Shirley Chisholm said, if there's not a place at the table, bring a folding chair. I bring a folding chair, but that is coming from an understanding of separatism and still trying to be assimilated, sort of. I think it's just a real hard negotiation and a highly personal one. What do you think, Stripe?
Turn the question back on the moderator.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that every strategy is not neutral, right? That every interaction and interruption in patriarchy is not weighted equally, that there are some efforts and paths that perhaps have a greater effect on a collective undoing. Both Hildegard and Artemisia's strategies make sense. And I don't want to, pit one against each other and say which one I more identify with, but I raise the question to, I guess, bring into conversation or thought that, is every choice equally weighted? As women trying to navigate and self-preserve, do we have an obligation to our sisters, so to speak, or other women? Is it fair to only focus on one's self-preservation? Is that equally weighted, I guess, as someone who assimilates, join the system, tries to change it from the inside? And I don't know. It's not an easy question, but I don't think everybody's choice is necessarily the right one.
So you would feel comfortable judging another woman's choice? Be careful, this is a trap.
So where lies the difference between judgment and political analysis? I think I heard you say that back in 1995, perhaps. It's not a judgment, but it's a political analysis of the impact this choice may have on my life or on the well-being of people I care about.
And I will say something about myself. I was diagnosed with autism this year, 68, never too early. And I'm realizing now that my ability to stand apart from the herd, to be bullied, and to be treated incredibly badly was partly, I had the incest history, but also as an autistic person, we are really wired for incredible resistance to social conditioning. And so I could be all Joan of Arc about my courageous theater, blah, blah. But you know what? I really kind of feel like a lot of that was neurodivergence. I was wired to be able to take the heat of that situation and until at least I had a breakdown. But, so for me to stand and say, come on over here and join me, come on, Stripe. Yeah, you're going to lose your job and all your friends and your peer group and any publication possibility. But what's the matter? Can't you, it's like, that's not fair. I'm realizing now that my autism was actually kind of a superpower in terms of ability to stand against the grain, to set myself apart. Just comes naturally. If the herd's going that way, I'm going this way. And that is not true for other people. That becomes unbearable for them. I have no knowledge of that because I'm not neurotypical. So I think there's so many things, the privilege, skin privilege or, family money and all these things that factor in that can make somebody look terribly independent and fierce and even courageous until you see what they actually have going on, you know? And like Artemisia and Hildegard, different circumstances. One of them had a daughter, not to be discounted, and she apparently lived as a single mom. There was a husband, but she seemed to have gotten rid of him. Uh, I could never have made the choices I made. It would have been immoral if I'd had children to support. I couldn't have. There's no way.
So the mark of a Gage play, you like to infect the audience with the problem, and then we are then here left to reflect on the complexities and figure out what to do next. So here we are presented with two women who choose very different strategies for survival, and subsequently they open up to each other in order to defend and explain their choices. And then when it becomes too much to bear, Artemisia shuts down the conversation. So how might we use this play as an indication of what to do next? Can women or various communities have different survival strategies and be allies? And if I may elaborate a bit before you respond, for me, what resonates in this conversation, or what is most palpable in my real world, is the rift that has developed between lesbians and some folks in the trans queer movement. So as I was talking earlier about my experiences at Michigan Women's Music Festival, it shaped me. And while those feelings and those memories, now live in me, as time away from Fest grows, that feeling of being connected to other butch women and to loving myself in that fierce and powerful way fades. I mean, it was easy to do when I saw the others, and now that I don't see the others, it's hard to manifest that feeling. And I know that some folks in the LGBTQ umbrella worked hard to eradicate and destroy this female-only space by blacklisting artists who perform there, disseminating disinformation, teaching a new generation of what could be allies, to discredit women who organize around a sex-based, i.e. female identity, instead of opting for the more nebulous and seemingly progressive category of gender. So the intentional erosion and destruction of this female space that is now marked as trans exclusionary space is very painful to me. And that residual effect of the loss on me as a female butch is profound. So while I want to do work in coalition to liberate queer and trans people, I feel a bit guarded. Like I need my pain to be acknowledged and understood before I can be a good ally. So how do I move forward and respect and honor another group's pain when that same group is actively working on or responsible for some of mine? How do I function as an ally when the platform or some of the practices undermine my well-being? For example, that pronoun question, right? I just want people to stop asking me my pronoun. When I came out in the 90s, it was primarily heterosexual people asking me if I was a boy or a girl. And nowadays it's primarily queer people asking me what pronoun I prefer. And I just want that question to stop. I don't want to have to say what I am. But if I raise that critique or share my story about what it feels like to be asked what I am, I become persona non grata. All this to say and share, my question then becomes, can we co-thrive? Can we find a liberating ethic, law, philosophy for all of us in the LGBTQ umbrella? Or does one view dominate at the expense of the other? How do we move forward and build something from this hurt and mess?
Well, I have more questions than answers, which is one of the reasons that this is not something I speak a lot about, because I don't have answers, but I have questions. Um, And I'm just going to quote Bernice Johnson Reagan, founder, I think, of Sweet Honey in the Rock, mother of Toshi. Um, and she said something to the effect that if you're not so uncomfortable you can't stand it, you're not really doing coalition. And that helped me because, particularly in the no to men years, I thought, oh my God, if this is this painful, I must be doing everything wrong. And I think that's not true. I think we need to up our sitting with discomfort game, and that's tough. That is really tough. And so that's one of the pieces of wisdom I bring to the table. I assume she was talking about coalition with white feminists in the 60s, 70s, or white people in the civil rights era, and then white feminists in the women's movement, blah, blah, blah. But I also, there's another quotation that's very meaningful to me. Collaborate. This one gives me hope. That one kind of tells me, dike up, Carolyn, dike up. This one gives me hope. Collaboration is not about gluing together existing egos. And that's a scenario Stripe just really laid out. And we're all feeling that one. Collaboration is not about gluing together existing egos. It's about the ideas that never existed until after everyone entered the room. And I want to stress that again, we haven't seen these ideas yet because not everyone enters the room. And now I'm just going to give a little exposition on conflict resolution 101. If you ever take a workshop on conflict resolution, the first step, you have to begin by finding a definition of the problem that's acceptable to all parties. Now, what I've heard for 30 years in this current situation that Stripe is talking about, this started in the late 80s. This is a thing that's been going on for 30 fucking years. And this is the two positions. You should shut up and go away. No, you should shut up and go away. That's been the approach since the late 1980s. It has never worked and it never will. And what I see is threats of escalating violence and attempts to silence on both sides. And I could certainly go deeply into that when people try to claim it's only on one side, but that's not what I want to do tonight. But let me make it clear, nobody's going to go away and nobody's going to shut up. And if you haven't learned that in 30 years, you haven't been paying attention. So the order of business is conflict resolution 101. The search for a definition of the problem that's going to be acceptable to all parties. That's what we need to do. That is the hard part. That's going to be the Bernice Johnson Reagan wildly uncomfortable part. It's also the hope part about the ideas that have never existed before because we haven't all been in the room together. This is where we have to go, unless you enjoyed the last 30 years and the current escalation. And how do we incentivize ourselves? As Stripe said so poignantly, these are people that don't want to hear about what's happening to me. They don't want to hear my pain, so why should I want to do coalition with them? How can we incentivize ourselves to have these incredibly uncomfortable conversations? We have to bear in mind it's really how badly we need an LGBTQI coalition, and we do. Otherwise, we're living in Rupertsburg, or else we're dissociating aspects of our identity as a survival strategy. A lot of young lesbians are having to having to split off the significance of female anatomy or the entire history of sex-based women's rights and what that has meant historically. They have to check that at the queer door or they can't come in the room. That's dissociation. So as we saw in this play, we've got Hildegard, who's off in Rupertsburg, marginalized. And then we have Artemisia, who is checking huge, I am not a woman artist. She's checking huge parts of herself as price of being in the game. We have to find a way together because it's going to take all of us to cut off the head of patriarchy. We have to understand that what we've done for 30 years is stupid. And I know from 28 years in Al-Anon, you're not allowed to talk about how awful the other person is. Your sponsor just right there, like, what are you going to do? What are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, well, I'm just talking about how awful they are and how they need to go away or shut up or whatever, which is what they're doing too. This is not productive. So I think I'll shut up now. that was what I wanted to say.
So I've already asked this, but I want to ask it differently. This is my final question. Is there hope for these two women, Artemisia and Hildegard, to become allies? And what will it take? Akia, you're nodding. Do you have thoughts to share?
They would need to learn how to listen to each other and really listen. Really listen without just holding, what you want to say next. Just really listen to each other and be kind. And one of the things that I learned in community was that being vulnerable is really totally part of it. But one of the things that I learned after living in community is that being vulnerable is really important, but also having personal boundaries while you're being vulnerable is just as important. So basically, be kind and love each other, including loving yourself.
And I want to hear from Kate. And I just want to say, you have no idea, those of you watching this, you have no idea what goes into a webinar. Oh my God. And Kate, thank you. Thank you
My
so
pleasure.
much. Seriously. She's got this list that goes on for pages of turn on the this, turn off the that, da 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 da. Remind Akia to put her dog in the garage. You know, I mean, it's like, she was like,
Or
you know,
how about mute yourself?
oh, I guess.
No,
Unmute.
well,
Well,
thank
Kate, unmute yourself. This is your
yeah.
time.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure doing this, and I do this from a perspective of a female heterosexual, and out of deep respect for your work and your performances and um, what it brings for people to come together. And thinking about some of your questions too, I think that a lot of how we're feeling is attacked and threatened as individuals, and no matter what our identity is, and it's trying to think of ourselves as being human. And another one, we have really amazing questions right here right now, but one of the things that comes up right now is, how do we all learn and listen without triggers interfering with respectful communication and understanding? And that makes me think about your question, or your point, Stripe, about you don't want to be asked your pronouns, and yet in some ways I would see that as an opening to a conversation, whereas for you it would be a closing of a conversation. And how do we speak to each other in respectful language that doesn't shut the door on how, or make us walk away and leave? But it's a really good question, is how do we keep ourselves from being triggered by things that would prevent us from speaking and working together?
So we have maybe come to the end of the time, or we have a few minutes left. Carolyn,
I'd
what do
like
you
to,
think?
I think we've been kind of answering stuff that was
Sure.
important to us. Kate,
Let's have
you're
Kate.
gonna, Kate, vet some of those questions for us. And by the way, I'm gonna get a printout of all these,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna try to send personal emails to everybody. So if we didn't get to you tonight, don't worry about it. And there are 181 at this point. So Kate, what are some of the questions that,
There's some really amazing questions. It's really a lot to go through, but what I would say here is, this is one from Kristen Knapp, I believe. I think I move back and forth between separatist space like Southern Oregon women's lands and the larger queer community in the city. I find I need both and cannot stay isolated forever, but have to go back there from time to time. How do you see this moment in our collective national life?
well, Stripe and IKEA jump in. For me, it's a concept, it's a daily negotiation.
Mm.
And it is, I mean, figuring out what you need in any given hour, right? What you need at noon was different than what you needed in the morning. And it's allowing yourself space and and time to reflect and figure that out. And I think it's important to not be, as I opened my comments, I was talking about how we get so stuck in our own belief system because it's the path we needed to survive. And so, like the characters in the play this evening, they're so bent on defending that and explaining themselves. But stepping back and allowing yourself to veer and move and shift and grow, and come into one community and into another and out. And so allowing that your own movement and growth as a necessary piece of your own conversation. We get very rigid. I'm 45 and I see my own rigid ideas, and I've eased up since when I was 25. I think I was in my 20s, Carolyn, when I met you at the University of Nebraska. And I was just in a different space. And so allowing ourselves to evolve and grow and learn and try new things on. But I'll stop talking.
I'd just like to say that I once wrote a whole song about being torn between the city and the country, which is basically being torn between women's community and the rest of the world. And I think it's pretty common that a lot of us feel that.
I have another question. If you were to write the second and third act in this play.
Nice one.
Oh, but I have. And there's at least 60 plays I wrote since then, and all of them are, I mean, that's a central, the assimilation versus separatism. It's very much present in Harriet Tubman Visits a Therapist. It's my latest play, In McClintock's Corn. I just finished this year. And I like that play because it foregrounds McClintock as a woman with autism. And but she chose to spend her entire life in almost monastic isolation in order to be able to do research instead of teaching, because they would only hire women in her era to teach. And so she took a backwater job to be able to do what she loved. It was the same thing. So here I am 30 years later, still really exploring the price that we pay. I chose to write the plays, big time autism, the plays that are my special interest, the way like some people with autism collect stamps or grow orchids. The plays that I write are that thing. And I chose to do that no matter what the price was. And that's a very autistic thing. Like, I'll dominate the conversation. I don't want to share. I never want to pass the mic. This is all autism. So that's kind of how, it worked for me. I can't even remember the question now, but hope I answered it. The second and third act. Yeah, I'm still just writing iterations of it. Iterations of it. Yeah.
So should we take one last question?
Yeah.
And then, as Carolyn promised, for those of you who asked a question and didn't get a response here in the talk back, Carolyn will make an effort to respond to you personally. So what's one last question, Kate?
Let's see. I think what comes out is, well, we've got, did you have conscious thought about the audience as part of this conversation that you were playing in this play, and how it interacted with the responses from Artemisia or Hildegard? Was the audience a part of that thinking?
I'm feeling I don't understand that question. Can anybody kind of help me with that? Like, what? I'm not clear what they're asking.
So did you intend the audience as a third character?
Oh, very much so, because we
Yeah,
break the
that's
fourth
the better
wall.
question.
Akia comes out, or Hildegard comes out,
Mhm.
like, you know what? I just am going to ask us all to ban, to no plat. I was talking about no platforming 30 years ago. I hope you get how brilliant that was. I'm going to ask all of you to no platform women like Carolyn, blah, blah, or like Artemisia. And then I come out like, yeah, that's fine. But before we do that, let's just fucking call her on all her total sainthood bullshit. And in a live audience, it was a little scary first time I did it. People didn't want to raise their hand. I'm like, you locked a child up for 8 years. Come on, raise your hand. And I'm like, I can't believe audiences isn't doing this. But yeah, it very much breaks the fourth wall. And that was a little tougher than I thought it would be. Yeah, I did. And I was always writing for that community. That's what happened when I moved to Southern Oregon. I met my audience, and that was the heartbreak. I went to Michigan for 14 years. That was the only place on the planet that my audience existed, and it was only for 5 days. And I just vacuumed it up, and it would last me for a whole year. And Michigan Festival closed in 2015, and it causes me daily pain because my audience doesn't exist anywhere else. In my lifetime, I can only count maybe in 30 years a half dozen lesbian theater companies. Most of them never even lasted 3 years. I could write a book about why lesbians don't do theater. And it isn't because we're not talented performers. We're fucking still alive, aren't we? We perform all the time. Give me a break. And it's not because we don't have stories. We have stories that are so radical, so never been seen on the stage before. They would make huge bank. They're just not allowed to be seen. And I am blacklisted. And again, it's like what Artemisia says: just look at the play. Forget who I am. Just look at the goddamn play. They won't do that. Like, they come after the woman, and then all of her work is completely trash because we don't like her opinions. I mean, I feel like and again, I just lost the track of where I was going with that. What was I talking about? Oh, the question about the audience in mind. Yeah, and that's a big challenge when you write for an audience that doesn't exist. Like, a mainstream audience comes and sees my plays. And I remember going to Black theater like 40 years ago and just being like, oh, I kind of wish I was invisible. It was clearly not written about me, for me, by me, serving the interests of white people. And it was disorienting, it was uncomfortable. And I get what men and maybe some straight women feel when they're in my at my plays. Um, but what are you going to do? I have to write what I know. So anyway, but yeah,
Thank
audio
you
is important.
for sharing this specific play. I think all of us not only learned or were introduced to two artists in more depth and complexity, but seeing your work unfold in the way that it does, it's brilliant, brilliant. So thank you, Carolyn, for creating this piece, for sharing it here. Thank you, Akia and Kate, too, for being among us and for being part of a provocative and timely conversation about women's strategies and patriarchy, art, community, identity, and survival. Carolyn, give you the final word.
Kate, I just want to assure before we close this webinar, whatever we need to do to save the comments, I want to make sure that does happen. And don't forget to turn off the recording. And thank all of you for attending. And for hanging in there for a long talk back. I'm hoping to do some more of this. I'd actually kind of like to do In McClintock's Corn, the play I finished this year. I love that you're all here. I love you all, and you really keep me going. It was a rough year. The year of the blacklist and the year of the autism is how I think of. And then, oh yeah, there was a pandemic too.
Pandemic.
Thank you all so much. I love you more than I can say. And if you want to know how much I love you, it's in every line of every play that I ever wrote. So, mwah.
Thank you.
Let's
Thank
do
you.
it, Kate.